we're now into the last few days of February 2020. At this moment, at this stage in the unfolding of history, it definitely seems that the political career of Elizabeth Warren is over, whereas just a few short months ago, she seemed to have pretty good odds of becoming the President of the United States. Her odds were about as good as Bernie Sanders. There was a time a few years before that when Bernie Sanders himself actively promoted Elizabeth Warren as a possible candidate for President of the United States. And I think there's no doubt that many people in the general public understood what Elizabeth Warren represented as being the same slate of policy positions as Bernie Sanders, with a few select bullet points subtracted, a few exceptions to the rule substituted. There's no doubt that Elizabeth Warren was able to rise to such prominence as something less than Bernie Sanders. Paradoxically enough, you can say that Bernie Sanders cast a huge shadow, and then Elizabeth Warren's campaign was able to really gleam. It was able to shine out in this shadow because a lot of people, frankly, were apprehensive that Bernie Sanders would bankrupt the United States of America. A lot of people were apprehensive that Bernie Sanders claimed that he would completely decimate the armed forces, completely decimate foreign policy positions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, around the world, would have disastrous consequences for the balance of power on planet Earth. And Elizabeth Warren did indeed offer many of the same vague promises as Bernie Sanders, but less. We could subtract away the radicalism of Bernie Sanders on foreign policy. We could subtract away the radicalism of Bernie Sanders on, disassembling the military, shall we say. And we could put in a few sort of cautious words that she wasn't as game to bankrupt the United States in terms of profligate spending on new social programs, new ecological and healthcare and education and what have you. There was a little bit of hesitancy there. Now, in terms of optics, as I've mentioned many times, in some ways, what Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were selling was the same product, but with a very significant difference in packaging, because in terms of domestic policy, Bernie Sanders openly calls his product socialism, whereas you may say Elizabeth Warren was packaging her version of much the same domestic policies as compassionate capitalism. But she would use the C word, she would say she was a capitalist to her bones. I think it's inevitable that when people look back at this period of time, when they look back in the few months when Elizabeth Warren went from being a major contender for President of the United States to being totally discredited and discarded, they will probably remember a series of isolated statements she made, isolated gaffes, isolated ridiculous things. And that's a shame because I think there is something more meaningful here to reflect on, both in terms of the limited appeal of Bernie Sanders and in terms of understanding what was the appeal of Elizabeth Warren, now very much in the past tense. So I was much more familiar with Bernie Sanders than Elizabeth Warren, let's say 12 months ago now. Elizabeth Warren was a pretty marginal figure in American politics. She had never withstood the same level of scrutiny that Bernie Sanders had withstood back in the year 2016. Again, many people know Bernie's current political platform because he published a best-selling book explaining it. Whereas Elizabeth Warren had a series of rather slapdash, amateurish policy statements put on the internet, you could say as blog entries. And I have to say, I regarded that relatively positively. I thought, it didn't seem that a committee of experts had written those policy statements. Her tagline was, "I have a plan for that." Her set of plans, they really did seem to be things that she had written herself, maybe sitting around the kitchen table and talking to a couple of friends or her husband or something about them before posting them. But they really did have the kind of handmade, amateurish quality to them that I felt kind of reflected well on her character. Like, okay, this is somebody who isn't afraid to just kind of set down her thoughts on a whole bunch of different areas of domestic, political, and economic policy, and as imperfect as it may be, put that forward on the record to be criticized. And let's be real here. They weren't criticized. There wasn't a lot of scrutiny directed towards Elizabeth Warren. She was able to come to so much prominence because she was thought of as representing the same list of policies of Bernie Sanders and less. It was like, okay, so you think of what Bernie Sanders represents, and then you subtract a few key points. And people, for many, many months of these debates, they were not really scrutinizing Elizabeth Warren as such on her own terms. They weren't really reading and criticizing her plans. I still, to this day, I've never once heard anyone in the media really discussing the content of those plans. And when I was reading them, which was a lot of work, I thought, wow, what she actually represents in these plans is very alien from the world of kind of professional news commentary, which tends to just react from minute to minute to things she happened to say in debates, but didn't seem to be based on doing that little bit of reading, that little bit of digging. Now, Elizabeth Warren as a personality became less and less appealing to the public as her tactics became more and more desperate. So there's no doubt she utterly humiliated herself with this ploy of trying to present Bernie Sanders as somehow an anti-feminist, trying to present Bernie Sanders as opposed to a woman being elected president. And that moment of her seeming to utterly lack personal integrity, even if the particular comments being made were trivial or it was merely grandstanding for the cameras, even if her gaffe was trivial in itself, that became the trigger for an avalanche of criticism directed at Warren that really should have happened earlier in the campaign. People on the left wing did not formally want to examine what was wrong in Warren's record. Now, the most obvious example being her claims about her ethnicity. Nobody wanted to sound like Donald Trump and criticize her for being a fake Native American, a fake Indian, these kinds of things. Nobody wanted, it's just, in the polite society of left-wing households, it wasn't something anyone wanted to talk about, anyone wanted to examine. With that triggering event of this ridiculous attempt to blacken Bernie Sanders' character and suggest that he's anti-feminist or anti-women's rights or something, then that whole discourse opened up again, yes. But people also went back and looked at the record of who she really was, and many, many issues she'd lied about. Her own past being, in fact, something of a Republican, rather more right-wing than anyone thought she was. People dug into the archives, dug into her history of different political involvement before she became famous or noteworthy, or before she appeared on television talking about financial corruption and reform to the banking sector, these things that now define her public image. Questions were asked and digging was done that should have been done on day one. And as I say, this only seemed to happen after we hit a breaking point. Now, one interesting thing to note is that the lies that have discredited Elizabeth Warren are of a very different character from the lies that Bernie Sanders leans on. And yes, I did just say Bernie Sanders is a habitual liar. And in a Machiavellian sense, it may make Bernie Sanders a better politician. It may. To be fair here, let's say something similar about Elizabeth Warren. Many people now complain that Elizabeth Warren accepts donations from millionaires and corporations and political action committees. People have complained that Elizabeth Warren does not maintain the same standard of moral purity that Bernie Sanders maintains in terms of who he will and will not solicit donations from and engage in fundraising with. Okay, but in a Machiavellian sense, some people might look at that and think, well, it shows that Elizabeth Warren is willing to fight dirty. She's willing to fight to win, and maybe that's an advantage. Maybe that is not entirely a disadvantage. Okay, in the same way, I think there are some people who will recognize the lies that Bernie Sanders is telling and say, okay, maybe this is a guy who knows how to campaign, he knows how to stay on message, and he knows that making these promises and keeping these campaign slogans going in the mass media, that's something quite different from the merely technical policy-making, analytical realm in which truth rather comes at a premium. Now, with that having been said, Bernie Sanders' lies and lying, they do seriously discredit him in my eyes, in my own judgment. I don't have any sympathy for someone who will stand on stage and say that wages in the United States of America have not increased in the last 40 years. Okay, that there's been no wage growth in the United States of America. And then I hear people on the left wing of the media repeating verbatim the same claim. And they don't do what, Fox News might even do. Believe me, I have no intellectual respect for Fox News. Okay, if you think the problem with America, if you think the unique problem with America is the lack of wage growth in the last 40 years, why don't you put up a chart showing that? Why don't you put up a chart showing percentage wage growth year by year and not in isolation? Why don't you compare the United States of America over 40 years to Japan over the last 40 years, Denmark over the last 40 years, any mature Western European economy? We can't compare the United States of America to China in the same period. You can't compare it to Cambodia, okay? How does the United States of America compare to the United Kingdom, all right? The notion, especially since, say, 1990, from 1990 to 2020, the notion that there has been this terrible paucity of wage growth, and moreover, that Bernie Sanders has the cure for that problem, that Bernie Sanders is going to solve that. You tell me the policy that's going to solve that in Bernie Sanders' arsenal. This is a lie of a sort very different from what Elizabeth Warren trades in. And I admit, I do find Elizabeth Warren's lies more psychologically disturbing. But the lies told by Bernie Sanders may indeed be portentous of really grave problems to come if he comes to power, or even if Bernie Sanders somehow loses this election. I can imagine these lies still being very influential in the future of the Democratic Party, the future of the United States of America, frankly, the future of Western democracy and in other countries around the world. I've read the book by Bernie Sanders. It's right over there on that table. So, I know his policy positions from that perspective. I listen to his lectures. I also watch his carefully crafted public messages in YouTube videos that are on his own channel. It alarmed me when I saw him lying, really palpable, provable lies in making his argument for the $15 an hour minimum wage. And, one of the reasons this is disturbing to me is, why do you have to lie? Like, it's such an easy argument to make. It's such an easy argument to make on the basis of truth or even just sympathy. Just asking people to sympathize. Just ask people to sympathize. Just say, hey, look, here's somebody who works in a coffee shop and earns only $8 an hour. Wouldn't the world be a better place if they earned $12 an hour or $15 an hour, whatever you want to say? The specific claims made, and again, you talk about the videos. This includes, carefully edited quotations from people put together from interviews, in addition to just the text of what Bernie Sanders himself proclaims. The claims made about Amazon, the corporation Amazon, and how much they pay their employees, incredibly misleading and dishonest and easily debunked. Before even Jeff Bezos came out to challenge the numbers Bernie Sanders was presenting, I just Googled around and I found, guys, this doesn't add up at all. What Bernie Sanders is saying is really misleading here, and intentionally so. There's no way that could be a mistake, and he did it again and again and again and again. It's not something he said once and then forgot about. This is a major propaganda tool he used. What he was saying about Disney Corporation. And again, there's a very easy, honest argument to make that Disney should pay its employees more. But again, when you get into the specifics of the message and how he presents it, and sure, just to mention one more topic that was covered specifically on this YouTube channel, the lies he tells on behalf of the dairy industry. Okay, what does Bernie Sanders have to gain from lying on behalf of the dairy industry? In a sense, if you're lying on behalf of Saudi Arabia, in relation to the war currently being fought in Yemen, which, by the way, is a big deal and nobody in the white Western English-speaking world seems to want to pay attention to. And if Bernie Sanders is elected, he says he's just going to abandon all those foreign policy entanglements America's in. Okay, whereas Elizabeth Warren doesn't make such rash and extreme statements. There's a question. Look, okay, when Bernie Sanders is asked about foreign policy, is he lying? Is he lying? When you ask Bernie Sanders the first time, this includes in the debates, by the way, when you ask him the first time, so would you just walk out of Afghanistan? You get a kind of waffling answer that indicates, yes, he's just going to walk out of Afghanistan. When you ask a more specific question, and again, you've seen this even in the debates, but you can see this in interviews and so on too. A specific question like, Donald Trump recently was in negotiations with the Taliban, and many people faulted him for that, and the negotiations didn't do well, and so on and so forth. If you were president of the United States, would you negotiate with the Taliban? Would you hand over control of Afghanistan to the Taliban? To call the reply Bernie Sanders gives to this kind of question, to call it a waffle would be an insult to honest pancakes. All right? Is Bernie Sanders lying about military and foreign policy? Or is he just making promises, he can't keep? All right? Does Bernie Sanders have the intestinal fortitude to stand by as the Taliban comes and burns down schools and colleges offering education to women, as the Taliban destroys the democracy, the system of elections that the American people put billions of dollars into? We're not debating now whether or not it would have been wise in the first place for America to spend those billions of dollars and kill large numbers of people. The money was spent, people were killed, created democracy, created educational institutions, created hospitals, and now do you want to hand back control of that to the Taliban? That's the situation we're in now, right? That's why Obama didn't just walk out of Afghanistan, and that's why Donald Trump didn't just walk out, even though Donald Trump's election promises basically were that he was just going to walk out of Afghanistan. In case your memory is too short to remember that. Donald Trump, amazingly, he was the anti-war candidate because, Hillary Clinton was so pro-war. It was crazy, all right? Look, the type of lies I get from Bernie Sanders consistently, and these include lies about economics and social policy. Some of them are lies about the United States of America, and some of them are lies about other countries abroad that he's favorably contrasting the United States to. Some of them are not lies. They're just wishful thinking of such a childlike sort that I can't imagine Bernie Sanders believes what he's saying. I can't imagine he thinks you can have a $15 minimum wage without completely decimating manufacturing in the United States of America, without completely wiping out industry and agriculture as we know it, without having astounding impact across the board in the American economy, without more jobs leaving the United States to go to Mexico, to go to China, and so on. These very, very obvious and inevitable consequences. I do not know how it's possible for Bernie Sanders to offer free tuition to everyone in America in a manner so much more naive than the Corbyn government in England. So Corbyn lost the elections. I shouldn't say the Corbyn government. But anyway, when Corbyn in the United Kingdom was promising to offer free tuition, if you look at what the promise was, it came with also a total restructuring and redefinition of how the universities worked, where basically these would cease to be independent, private, for-profit, scam institutions. He was going to create a national education service parallel to the National Health Service that they already have in the United Kingdom. So, if all of the university professors are directly employed by the federal government, in the same sense that all of the soldiers in the military are employed by the federal government, yes, then you can offer free tuition to everyone. If you have incredibly corrupt, self-serving, multi-billion-dollar for-profit institutions, if you have education structured the way it is now, there are problems with taking an already incredibly wasteful, incredibly expensive, incredibly corrupt system and then removing the price mechanism from it. It will only get worse. And this is not a long-term, far-off distant problem. What Sanders is proposing there, it either entails many other fundamental reforms that are indeed socialist in character, like creating a national education service, or immediate total collapse and failure and wasting of billions of dollars, huge amount of money. As I pointed out, Bernie Sanders continues to vilify big pharma, pharmaceutical corporations. And he blames these mysterious corporations and their conspiracy for why healthcare is so expensive in America. And he compares the price of healthcare in America to the price of healthcare in France and Canada. He doesn't mention Scotland much anymore. He used to in the past. Scotland is another example. Taiwan is another example. Taiwan is single-payer healthcare, right? True single-payer healthcare in Taiwan. Okay. Never mentions that doctors and nurses are paid dramatically less in those countries. I have a friend who's in nursing college right now. He's in the process of becoming a nurse. There are levels to being a nurse. He already was a nurse, but he's becoming a higher level nurse. And his professors there, they are all aware, and they have discussed with him that if Bernie Sanders is elected, medical doctors will earn less money, nurses will earn less money, that this is a type of reform that will negatively impact their economic position. And I thought that was interesting because when in the past I've talked about this, I got a lot of stupid hate mail, people writing into me and saying, oh, well, you should know this union of nurses supports Bernie Sanders. Like, yeah, I'm glad to hear that. But the real struggle here is not going to be Bernie Sanders against Big Pharma. As soon as it's clear that Bernie Sanders means lower wages for nurses, then his struggle is going to be with the nurses union. It's going to be with nurses and doctors as such. And we're not having that debate now. We're not having that discussion now because we're all just in dreamland where Bernie Sanders gets to make these promises to a completely uncritical audience, completely uncritical mass media. I mean, look, the mass media is critical, but in ways that are irrelevant and meaningless. I mean, obviously, the way the mass media praises someone like Joe Biden, tries to make Pete Buttigieg into a credible candidate. Yes, there's a sense in which Bernie Sanders is criticized, but it is not a substantive, detailed sense in this way of examining the falsehoods in the argument he's making, nor is it looking at the knock-on implications for the economy as a whole, the society as a whole, if he were elected, if he were actually to attempt to bring about the reforms that he's promising. Look, would the world be a better place if Bernie Sanders were president instead of Donald Trump? Yes. Would the world be a better place if Elizabeth Warren were elected president instead of Donald Trump? Yes. This is setting the threshold rather low. There are very worrying signs. Bernie Sanders lies. Elizabeth Warren, in a very different way, lies. They are both somewhat Machiavellian characters. They are both people of, shall we say, finite personal integrity. And I am concerned. I remember a time when in England, there was all this excitement over New Labour, the Labour Party. And I should do a book review of it now. There was a hit book. Does anyone else remember this? The Stakeholder Society. Nobody really looked into who Tony Blair was. They saw Tony Blair in the shadow of the hard left wing, the communists, frankly, he competed against. They saw him in the shadow of people like Corbyn, although Corbyn was a young man then. The people like that who were further left. They saw Tony Blair in the shadow of the incredibly unpopular Conservative Party of the recent past at that time. And Tony Blair seemed like the answer to all our problems. And no one even thought to question the extent to which Tony Blair was a religious maniac. To some extent, it's like the ethnicity of Elizabeth Warren. Left-wing people just don't want to talk about that. They just don't want to talk about the fact that Tony Blair is the kind of guy who thinks that God talks to him in prayer and who converted to Catholicism the minute his prime ministership ended, that he is someone who is guided by faith and who is really a faith-based politician, allegedly on the left wing. There were really serious warning signs about Tony Blair's character. And you know what? It's not the case that Tony Blair made insane political decisions on the basis of a Ouija board or on the basis of having his answered prayer or having the Virgin Mary appear to him in a dream. It didn't go that far. It didn't. There were really serious warning signs about who Tony Blair was and what political agenda he represented, even in that book he published. Nobody wanted to hear it. Nobody wanted to see what was even written on the page, and nobody even wanted to evaluate that man himself as such, his character, let alone his objectives and whether or not he achieved them, so on and so forth. Very often in politics, people choose a politician just because they want something new and something different. Bernie Sanders and his peculiar brand of socialism, it's something new, it's something different. I'm here to tell you, if you do the reading, if you check his factual claims, if you just Google around and check the numbers, if you just think about it for a minute, there are some red flags here. There are, in fact, some warning signs.